In the fall of 2013, the quiet mountain community of Cedar Ridge was unsettled by the discovery of a weathered backpack. It had vanished without a trace 25 years prior, leaving behind only unanswered questions. But when Park Ranger Sarah Chen stumbles upon this forgotten relic, she uncovers a truth so disturbing it would unravel the very fabric of her peaceful existence and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The morning air bit at Sarah's exposed cheeks as she worked her way through the debris field left by last week's windstorm. Broken branches the size of telephone poles lay scattered across the maintenance trail like the discarded bones of giants. The chainsaw's weight pooled at her shoulders, its steel teeth still warm from cutting through the massive pine that had blocked the hiking path for 6 days. She shut off the engine and wiped sawdust from her safety glasses. The sudden silence felt absolute, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the remaining trees. 23 years of working these mountains had taught her to appreciate these moments of stillness when the forest seemed to hold its breath. The hollowed-out log caught her attention because it shouldn't have been there. The lightning strike that had split the ancient pine had created a perfect cavity in its trunk, like a wooden tomb carved by nature's violence. Something dark was wedged deep inside the hollow space. Sarah knelt beside the log, her knees pressing into the carpet of damp pine needles. The smell of decomposing wood and earth filled her nostrils. She reached inside the cavity, her fingers brushing against something that felt like fabric, synthetic and stiff with age and weather. The backpack came free with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting all these years to be found. Forest green canvas, faded to the color of old moss. The metal buckles had turned the rusty brown of dried blood. Sarah turned it over in her hands, noting the way the fabric held together despite decades of mountain weather. A small zippered pocket on the front panel contained something hard and rectangular. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized the familiar shape, a disposable camera, the kind people used before digital photography consumed the world. The plastic casing had turned yellow with age, but the internal mechanisms appeared intact. She stood slowly, the backpack cradled against her chest like a sleeping child. The forest around her suddenly felt different, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. Whatever story this camera held had been waiting 25 years to be told. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the camera over, searching for any identifying marks. A strip of masking tape, barely legible after decades of moisture and cold, clung to the bottom edge. The faded ink spelled out a name that made her breath catch in her throat. M. Westbrook. Maya Westbrook. The name landed in Sarah's memory like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition through 25 years of mountain lore. She had been a rookie ranger then, fresh out of training, when Maya and her younger sister Claire had vanished into these same woods without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The sisters had been experienced hikers, the kind who carried topographic maps in waterproof cases and knew to turn back when the weather shifted. Maya was 31, a geology professor from Denver. Claire, 28, worked as a wilderness guide in Aspen. They had planned a 3-day trek through the backcountry, following trails they had hiked since childhood. Their blue Honda Civic had been discovered at the Pinecrest trailhead on October 15, 1988. The doors were unlocked keys tucked beneath the driver's side floor mat, exactly where Maya always left them. Their departure permits, filled out in Maya's precise handwriting, indicated they planned to camp at Devil's Lake on the first night before pushing deeper into the wilderness. The search had consumed 3 weeks and involved over 200 volunteers. Helicopters had buzzed overhead like mechanical wasps, their rotors beating the air into submission. Search dogs had followed scent trails that led nowhere, as if the sisters had simply evaporated into the mountain air. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had processed the scene, dusted for fingerprints, analyzed tire tracks, and found nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary hikers using a popular trailhead. Sarah remembered the faces of the volunteers, drawn and hollow-eyed, after days of combing through dense underbrush and calling names that echoed unanswered through the valleys. She remembered Maya's mother, a small woman with steel-grey hair who had stood at the command post every morning, offering coffee to the searchers and asking the same quiet question, "Anything today?" The case had gradually faded from local headlines, then from conversation, then from active memory. But Sarah had never forgotten the way Maya's mother had looked during those final days of searching, like someone watching her world dissolve one piece at a time. Now 25 years later, Maya Westbrook had returned to the mountains that had swallowed her whole. Detective Jim Morrison's office smelled of stale coffee and the particular mustiness that clung to files stored too long in basement archives. The Westbrook case folder sat open before him, its manila surface water-stained and soft with age. Sarah Chen had driven down from the ranger station that morning the mysterious camera, sealed in an evidence bag, that now rested beside his keyboard like an accusation. 25 years had passed since Morrison had worked his first missing persons case as a junior detective. The Westbrook sisters had taught him that some mysteries burrow deep and wait patient as predators for their moment to resurface. He flipped through witness statements, crime scene photographs, and interview transcripts, reacquainting himself with details that time had blurred. The primary suspect had been Marcus Westbrook Myers' ex-husband, whose volatility had escalated during their bitter divorce proceedings 18 months before the disappearance. Morrison found Marcus's interview transcript, his words preserved in the careful typescript of a 1988 police report. The man had been spotted at a gas station in Cedar Ridge on October 12th, 3 days before Maya and Claire vanished. He'd purchased cigarettes and asked the clerk about hiking trails in the area, an odd question for a man who preferred hunting to walking. The divorce records painted a picture of escalating threats. Marcus had accused Maya of hiding assets, had followed her to work, had appeared uninvited at her apartment complex. During one particularly heated exchange in the courthouse hallway, a bailiff had documented Marcus telling Maya that she wouldn't get away with ruining his life. The words carried new weight, now sitting heavy in the silence of Morrison's office. Marcus had claimed he was in Grand Junction, visiting his brother during the weekend the sisters disappeared. But his brother's initial statement had been vague, uncertain about specific dates. Phone records from 1988 showed gaps periods when Marcus couldn't be accounted for, when he could have driven the 2 hours to Cedar Ridge and back without anyone noticing. Morrison reached for his phone, then hesitated. Marcus Westbrook would be 58 now, assuming he was still alive. 25 years was long enough for a man to convince himself that old crimes were buried as deeply as old bodies. Long enough to grow comfortable with secrets. The detective's fingers drummed against the desk as he stared at the evidence bag containing Maya's camera. Somewhere in that plastic shell were the final moments of 2 women's lives captured in the amber of undeveloped film. Whatever those images revealed would either confirm old suspicions or shatter them entirely. Morrison's fingers found the second thick file in the Westbrook folder, this one marked with a red flag that indicated a potentially dangerous individual. Dale Kimmer had been 34 in 1988, a local hunter whose erratic behavior had made him a person of interest in the sisters' disappearance. The photograph paperclipped to the inside cover showed a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to focus on something beyond the camera's lens. Dale lived alone in a cabin 15 miles northeast of Cedar Ridge, surviving on disability payments and whatever game he could hunt legally, and some he couldn't. His military discharge papers cited psychological instability following combat exposure, a clinical phrase that failed to capture the man's complete detachment from normal social behaviour. 3 witnesses had placed Dale on or near the hiking trails during the week Maya and Claire vanished. A family camping at Bear Creek reported a man matching his description arguing loudly with 2 female hikers about trespassing on his territory. The confrontation had escalated until the women walked away, but the witnesses couldn't provide detailed descriptions of the hikers beyond 2 dark-haired women with expensive gear. Dale's initial interview had been conducted at the sheriff's station because his cabin lacked electricity and phone service. Morrison read through Detective Ray Holbrook's notes, sensing his predecessor's frustration bleeding through the clinical language. Dale had answered questions with long silences, sudden non sequiturs about government surveillance, and rambling stories about voices in the woods that warned him about strangers. The man claimed he had been hunting elk during the time period in question, but couldn't provide specific dates or locations. His truck had been searched with his consent, revealing nothing more incriminating than unwashed clothes, empty beer cans, and a rifle that wasn't properly licensed. Dale had seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would want to talk to him about missing hikers. Morrison found the follow-up report filed 2 weeks later. Dale had been spotted by a trail maintenance crew sitting motionless beside a creek for hours, talking to himself in what sounded like 2 different voices. When approached, he had fled into the dense woods with an agility that seemed impossible for a man his age. A psychological evaluation ordered by the court had deemed Dale detached from reality, but not demonstrably violent. The evaluating doctor had noted that while Dale exhibited signs of severe social anxiety and possible paranoid delusions, he showed no history of aggression toward women or tendency toward organized criminal behavior. But Morrison knew that 25 years could change a man in unpredictable ways. Mental illness could deepen and darken, especially when left untreated in the isolation of the mountains. The civil litigation files occupied an entire banker's box in the county courthouse basement, and Morrison spent 3 hours sifting through depositions, environmental impact studies, and corporate correspondence that painted a picture of escalating conflict between the Westbrook sisters and Consolidated Timber Corporation. Maya's expertise in geology had made her an effective witness in the sisters' lawsuit against the logging company. Her soil samples and erosion measurements had documented damage to protected watersheds, while Claire's intimate knowledge of wildlife migration patterns had shown how illegal clearcutting was disrupting elk calving grounds and destroying crucial habitat corridors. The case had been building toward trial when the sisters vanished. Their disappearance had effectively ended the litigation, as their attorney couldn't proceed without his key witnesses. Consolidated Timber had quietly settled with the environmental groups 6 months later for an undisclosed amount, then had shut down their Cedar Ridge operations entirely. Morrison found correspondence between Maya and her attorney from the weeks before the disappearance. The letters revealed that Maya believed she had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in Consolidated Timber's environmental compliance reports. She had been scheduled to testify about falsified data and bribed inspectors' testimony that could have resulted in criminal charges and millions in federal fines. A knock on the courthouse file room door interrupted Morrison's reading. Tom Garrett stood in the doorway, a man in his late 50s with prematurely white hair and the kind of honest face that inspired immediate trust. He wore khakis and a flannel shirt that looked like they came from the working section of his closet, not the boardroom. "Detective Morrison, I'm Tom Garrett from Consolidated Timber. Well, former Consolidated Timber. I heard you were looking into the old Westbrook case." His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who had spent years outdoors. "I thought I might be able to help." Morrison gestured to a chair across from the file boxes. I appreciate you coming forward, Mr. Garrett. Call me Tom. Look, what happened to those girls was a tragedy. The whole company was devastated when they disappeared. Maya and Claire were good people, even if we disagreed about the logging practices. Tom leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. I brought some files from my personal archives, maps, work schedules, employee records from 1988. Thought they might help fill in some gaps. The manila envelope Tom handed over was thick with documents, all meticulously organized and labeled. I was the liaison between the company and the environmental groups back then. Tried to keep things civil, you know. Both sides had valid points. Morrison appreciated the man's straightforward manner and obvious desire to cooperate fully with the investigation. The photo lab on Main Street looked like a relic from another era squeezed between a coffee shop and a used bookstore in one of Cedar Ridge's few remaining original buildings. Sarah had driven straight there from the courthouse, the evidence bag containing Maya's camera resting on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. Morrison arrived 10 minutes later, his unmarked sedan pulling into the space beside her truck. Together, they watched through the lab's front window as elderly proprietor Frank Hutchins handled the camera with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient pottery. "Film's brittle," Frank called through the thin wall separating the customer area from his darkroom. "Gonna take some time to process without damaging it. Color's probably shifted, but we should get images." The wait stretched 90 minutes. Sarah paced the narrow shop while Morrison studied Tom Garrett's meticulously organized files. The lumber company liaison had included detailed topographic maps marked with logging boundaries, employee work schedules, and even weather reports from October 1988. Everything seemed designed to be helpful to demonstrate Consolidated Timber's complete cooperation with the investigation. Frank emerged from the darkroom carrying a manila envelope thick with photographs. His weathered hands shook slightly as he spread the images across the counter under harsh fluorescent light. 23 photographs told the story of two sisters enjoying what should have been an ordinary hiking trip. Maya and Claire grinning beside their packed Honda. Maya adjusting her backpack straps, while Claire consulted a trail map. A close-up of wildflowers, slightly out of focus, probably taken by Claire. Maya pointing at something off-camera, her mouth open in apparent delight. The images progressed chronologically through their first day on the trail. Sarah could almost feel the sisters' excitement and camaraderie radiating from the photographs. Claire had clearly been the more artistic photographer, capturing compositions that showed the interplay of light and shadow through the forest canopy. Maya preferred documentary shots, trail markers, geological formations, her sister's reactions to particularly beautiful vistas. The 24th photograph was different. The image was dark, blurred by camera shake as if taken while running. Tree trunks created vertical slashes of shadow across the frame. The trail ahead disappeared into black nothingness. But in the lower right corner, barely visible against the darker background, was something that didn't belong in the wilderness. A geometric shape that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. Morrison leaned closer, squinting at the detail. "Is that?" "Vehicle emblem." Sarah whispered, her finger hovering over the spot, without quite touching the photograph. "Some kind of corporate logo." The final image had been taken in panic in the moments before Maya Westbrook's 25-year silence began. Morrison called Tom Garrett from the photo lab requesting an immediate meeting to discuss the emblem visible in Maya's final photograph. 20 minutes later, the three of them sat in Morrison's office while Tom studied the image under a magnifying glass, his face growing increasingly grave. "That's definitely a company logo," Tom confirmed, setting down the magnifying glass. "But I can't make out the specific design from this angle and lighting. We had several contractor vehicles working the area in 1988, plus our own fleet." He paused, running his fingers through his white hair. "You know who might be able to help Bill Henderson? He was our chief surveyor back then, knows every vehicle that ever worked these mountains." Morrison made the call while Tom and Sarah waited. Bill Henderson agreed to come to the station immediately, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to being consulted on technical matters. Henderson arrived 30 minutes later, a lean man in his early 70s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His handshake was firm, his manner quietly professional. He wore clean work clothes and steel-toed boots that showed recent use, suggesting someone who still spent time in the field despite his age. "Terrible business what happened to those girls," Henderson said as he examined the photograph. His voice carried genuine sympathy. "I remember them actually. Encountered them briefly on the trail system, maybe 2-3 days before they went missing. They were asking about some of the old logging roads, wanted to know which ones were still active." Morrison leaned forward. "You spoke with them directly?" "Just for a few minutes. They were concerned about hiking into active work zones, didn't want to interfere with operations or get hurt. Smart girls, very responsible." Henderson's weathered fingers traced the air above the emblem in the photograph, careful not to touch the evidence. "This logo, it's familiar, but the angle makes it tough to identify. Could be from any number of contractors we used." Henderson pulled a leather portfolio from his truck and spread detailed survey maps across Morrison's desk. The maps showed every road trail and structure in the area, with precise coordinates and elevation markers. His knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. He could recite the history of specific logging operations, explain which roads were seasonal and which remained accessible year-round. "I was working the eastern sector that week." Henderson recalled pointing to an area several miles from where the sisters had planned to hike. "Bad weather moved in, forced us to shut down early on Friday. I remember because I had to secure equipment before the storm hit." The surveyor's cooperation seemed complete and genuine. He offered to review company vehicle records and contact former employees who might remember additional details about contractor operations in 1988. The financial records Morrison pulled from Marcus Westbrook's 1988 bankruptcy filing painted a picture of a man drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline. The ex-husband's construction business had collapsed 6 months before Maya and Claire disappeared, leaving him owing $47,000 to creditors and facing foreclosure on his house. Maya's life insurance policy, purchased during their marriage, named Marcus as the sole beneficiary for $250,000. The payout would have solved every financial problem in his life, with money left over for a fresh start. Morrison spread the documents across his desk, while Sarah Chen sat across from him studying Henderson's survey maps from the previous day's meeting. The surveyor's meticulous records showed work crews scattered across the forest during October 1988, but Henderson's own schedule placed him safely away from the area where the sisters had planned to hike. "Marcus's alibi is tissue thin," Morrison said, pulling out the original interview transcripts. "His brother's statement from 1988 has more holes than Swiss cheese. Says Marcus was there for the weekend, but can't remember which weekend, what they did, or when he arrived." The detective had spent the morning making phone calls tracking down anyone who might remember Marcus Westbrook's whereabouts 25 years ago. The gas station clerk who had seen Marcus in Cedar Ridge was long dead. The motel records from Grand Junction had been destroyed after 7 years as required by law. But Morrison had found something else: credit card records that survived in the basement archives of a defunct bank. Marcus had purchased gas in Rifle, Colorado on October 14, 1988. Rifle was 60 miles closer to Cedar Ridge than Grand Junction, cutting his claimed alibi drive time by more than an hour each way. He could have easily driven from Rifle to the trailhead, done whatever he did to Maya and Claire, and been back to his brother's place before anyone noticed, Morrison concluded. The timing works perfectly. Sarah looked up from Henderson's maps. What about motive beyond the money? $250,000 is a lot, but he'd have to kill both sisters to prevent Claire from becoming suspicious. Morrison pulled out the divorce records, finding the passage he'd marked earlier. Maya had convinced Claire to cut all contact with Marcus after the divorce. She'd documented his threatening behaviour, his drinking, his escalating harassment. Claire hated him almost as much as Maya did. The evidence against Marcus Westbrook was circumstantial but compelling. Financial desperation means opportunity and a pattern of threatening behaviour toward both victims. Morrison could see the case building toward an arrest warrant. But something nagged at him about Henderson's survey maps, the precise detail, the helpful cooperation, the ready answers to every question. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's digital forensics lab occupied a sterile white room filled with monitors and processors that hummed like mechanical insects. Morrison watched technician Lisa Rodriguez manipulate Maya's final photograph on her computer screen, applying filters and enhancement algorithms that gradually pulled details from the darkness. The camera shake makes it tricky. Rodriguez explained, her fingers dancing across specialized software controls. But there's definitely something metallic reflecting light in this corner. Give me a few more minutes to isolate and enhance. Sarah stood behind Morrison's chair, her breathing shallow as the image slowly sharpened. What had appeared as merely a geometric shape in the original photograph was revealing itself to be something far more specific and damning. There, Rodriguez said, pointing to her enhanced image. Company emblem, definitely. I can make out text now and what looks like a stylized tree logo. Morrison leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening as familiar shapes emerged from digital noise. The emblem showed a pine tree inside a circle with text that became legible as Rodriguez continued her enhancement work. Henderson Survey Services. Precision mapping since 1975. Not consolidated timber. Not a contractor. Bill Henderson's own surveying business. Morrison's mind raced backward through every detail of Henderson's helpful cooperation. The surveyor had claimed to be working the eastern sector. During the week, Maya and Claire disappeared several miles from their planned route. But Maya's final photograph placed Henderson's truck directly on the trail where the sisters were hiking. Sarah's voice came as a whisper. He lied about where he was. Morrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through the notes from yesterday's interview. Henderson had been specific about his alibi, working the eastern sector, forced to shut down early Friday because of bad weather, spending time securing equipment. But weather records from 1988 showed clear skies until Sunday evening. The surveyor had also demonstrated encyclopedic knowledge of the trail system, knew which logging roads were active, could recite the history of specific operations. He'd mentioned encountering the sisters briefly and asking about active work zones. But Maya's photograph suggested something far more threatening than a brief encounter. Morrison's hands shook slightly as he realized Henderson had been present during every crucial moment of the renewed investigation. He'd provided the maps offered employee records guided their understanding of the terrain. He'd positioned himself as the helpful expert while steering suspicion toward Marcus Westbrook and away from himself. 25 years of careful planning and patient manipulation destroyed by a single undeveloped photograph. Morrison drove back to his office with Sarah in tense silence, both of them processing the implications of Henderson's truck emblem in Maya's final photograph. Once there, Morrison pulled out every document Henderson had provided, spreading them across his desk, like pieces of a puzzle that suddenly revealed a different picture entirely. The survey maps Henderson had shared were too detailed, too precise for routine commercial work. They showed unmarked trails, seasonal creek beds, and remote access points that only someone intimately familiar with illegal activities would need to document. Morrison realised these weren't standard logging maps. They were reconnaissance showing every possible route in and out of the forest where bodies could be disposed of without detection. Sarah found the first inconsistency in Henderson's employee records. Look at this work schedule. He shows crews working the eastern sector all week, but Tom Garrett's corporate files show that area was shut down for soil testing from October 10th through 18th. Morrison pulled out his interview notes from the previous day, reading Henderson's words with new understanding. The surveyor had mentioned that Maya and Claire asked about active work zones during their brief encounter. But according to Consolidated Timber's official records, there were no active work zones anywhere near the sisters' planned hiking route. Henderson shouldn't have known they were concerned about work zones unless he'd been the one to mislead them about dangerous areas. The detective's hands moved faster now, connecting details that had seemed helpful 24 hours earlier, but now revealed themselves as manipulation. Henderson had volunteered specific information about weather conditions, forcing early shutdown on Friday, but weather records showed clear skies. He'd mentioned securing equipment before a storm that never came. Most damning was Henderson's casual knowledge of the sisters' camping plans. During yesterday's interview, he'd mentioned they were planning to camp at Devil's Lake on the first night before pushing deeper into the wilderness. But that information hadn't been in any of the documents Morrison had shared with Henderson. It was only in Maya's departure permit filed at the ranger station and never released to Consolidated Timber employees. Henderson couldn't have known their specific itinerary unless he'd been following them, studying their plans, preparing for what he intended to do. Morrison reached for his phone to call for backup, then hesitated. Henderson was 70 years old, apparently alone, and had no idea the enhanced photograph had exposed his carefully constructed alibi. But 25 years of successfully hiding a double murder had required intelligence planning and ruthless calculation. The helpful old surveyor might be far more dangerous than he appeared. Morrison called for backup before driving to Henderson's property, a remote cabin situated on 15 acres of heavily wooded land 30 minutes north of Cedar Ridge. Deputy Martinez would approach from the access road, while Morrison took the logging trail that wound behind the property, a trail that Henderson's own maps showed in suspicious detail. The surveyor's truck sat in the gravel driveway, its familiar emblem catching afternoon sunlight like an accusation. Henderson emerged from his workshop before Morrison could reach the front door, wiping oil from his hands with a red shop rag. His weathered face showed no surprise at seeing the detective. "Mr. Henderson, I need to ask you some additional questions about 1988, Morrison said, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "I figured you might." Henderson's voice had lost its helpful tone, becoming flat and emotionless. "That camera turned up more than you expected, didn't it?" Morrison studied the man's face, seeing calculation where helpfulness had been before. "Your truck was photographed at the scene, Bill. Maya Westbrook's final picture shows your emblem clear as day." Henderson nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd long suspected. Smart girl Maya, too smart for her own good. She'd figured out that our soil reports were fabricated, that we'd been logging protected watersheds for 3 years. Her testimony would have shut down the entire operation and probably sent half a dozen people to federal prison. Including you. Especially me. I'd been falsifying survey data marking protected areas as approved for harvest. Maya had her own soil samples, her own elevation measurements. She could prove every lie I'd told. Henderson's hands remained steady as he spoke, showing no sign of the remorse Morrison had expected. 40 years of building a reputation, a pension, a life she was going to destroy, all of it for a bunch of trees. Morrison took a step closer. "So, you followed them into the forest?" I knew their route from the departure permits. Waited until they were deep enough that no one would hear. Henderson's eyes held the same calculating coldness Morrison had seen in career criminals. Maya fought harder than I expected. Claire tried to run, but she didn't know the terrain like I did. "Where are they?" "Bill." Henderson gestured toward the tree line behind his workshop. "Old mine shaft about half a mile back. Shaft's flooded, now has been for 20 years. They're not coming back." Deputy Martinez's radio crackled from the access road, confirming he was in position. Henderson made no attempt to flee or resist as Morrison moved forward with handcuffs. 25 years of perfect deception had ended with mechanical precision, as if Henderson had always known this moment would eventually arrive. 3 months later, Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the flooded mine shaft where Henderson had led investigators to recover Maya and Claire Westbrook's remains. The spring thaw had raised the water level, but dive teams had found what 25 years of searching had missed: 2 sisters who had trusted the wrong helpful stranger on a beautiful October morning. Henderson's trial had lasted 6 days. His confession eliminated any need for lengthy proceedings, but the prosecution had methodically presented evidence of planning manipulation and calculated deception that stretched back decades. The falsified survey reports the systematic fraud, the careful construction of alibis that had fooled investigators for a quarter century. Maya's mother had lived to see justice, though she'd aged decades in the months since Henderson's arrest. She sat in the courtroom's front row every day, her steel grey hair now pure white, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to the man describe murdering her daughters with the same clinical precision he'd once used to map forest boundaries. The judge had sentenced Henderson to life without parole, noting that his betrayal of public trust and environmental responsibility had compounded the horror of his crimes. The old surveyor had shown no emotion as the verdict was read, his face maintaining the same helpful expression that had fooled Morrison and Sarah completely. Sarah walked back toward her truck, where Detective Morrison waited beside the tailgate. The investigation had fundamentally changed how she viewed the forest she'd protected for over 2 decades. Every helpful stranger, every cooperative witness, every person who appeared exactly when needed, all of them carried the potential for deception. "Maya and Claire finally made it home," Morrison said quietly, referring to the private burial service held the previous week. Their mother seemed not peaceful exactly, but resolved. As they drove away from the mine shaft, Sarah looked at the forest around them one last time. The real journey was just beginning, learning to trust again, to see helpfulness without suspicion, to remember that most people were exactly what they appeared to be. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but truth endures, waiting patiently for its moment to surface. As they reached the main road, Sarah squeezed Morrison's shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever look at helpful people the same way again?" "We'll learn to," Morrison replied. "Justice doesn't heal everything, but it's a start." They stepped toward healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.